The Chicago skyline gleamed like a fortress of glass and steel. At the center stood VanCleef Innovations, an empire built on relentless ambition. Victoria VanCleef moved through the pristine marble lobby. She was a striking presence, draped in flawless white silk, projecting absolute authority. Her ice-blue eyes remained locked on her screen. She was not a woman who paused for the world paused for her. A public relations storm was unfolding. Red metrics and urgent messages signaled a catastrophic threat to a $10 billion corporate merger. Employees parted like water as she marched forward. Her focus was entirely consumed by the digital crisis, ignoring the physical world around her. 30 feet above the polished floor, Julian Hayes wrestled with a 1-ton reclaimed oak structure. His calloused hands moved with heavy, practiced precision. The weight of the timber was nothing compared to the crushing financial burden he carried. Every drop of sweat was a desperate bid for survival. Below, Victoria approached a bright yellow perimeter. It was a clear, unmistakable boundary separating the safe zone from an active workspace. Without a break in her stride, she pushed past the neon barrier. Her attention remained chained to the glowing screen in her hand. High above, unseen by anyone, a primary steel cable groaned under immense pressure. A microscopic fracture began to spread through the heavy metal. The metallic groan ended in a sharp, violent snap. The primary load-bearing carabiner gave way completely. 1 ton of solid reclaimed oak plummeted toward the marble floor. Gravity claimed the massive structure in a terrifying freefall. Julian did not hesitate. Driven by instinct, he vaulted from the lower tier of the scaffolding into the open air. He collided with Victoria, the force of his momentum carrying them both out of the drop zone in a fraction of a second. The chandelier struck the floor with devastating force. Splintered wood and pulverized marble exploded outward in a thick cloud. A heavy silence followed the crash. The grand lobby was entirely consumed by a thick haze of dust and debris. Victoria gasped for breath on the ruined floor. Her immaculate white coat was stained gray, her shattered phone cast aside. Julian pushed himself up, wincing at the sharp sting on his scraped forearm. He offered no hand to the billionaire beneath him. He towered over her, his green eyes burning with exhausted fury. He demanded to know if the digital screen was worth her life. Victoria, a woman accustomed to absolute reverence, froze. For the first time, she looked up at a man who was entirely immovable. By early afternoon, the chaos of the lobby had been replaced by the quiet hum of the executive suite. Victoria demanded a full dossier on the contractor. A sleek leather folder was placed on her glass desk. It contained the fragmented reality of Julian Hayes. She scanned the documents. A widower burdened by a $500,000 medical debt, his family home facing immediate foreclosure. Pinned to the last page was a photograph of a 7-year-old girl with blonde curls. His daughter, Chloe. Victoria did not see a tragic struggle. Through the lens of corporate survival, she saw the perfect, desperate asset. Miles away, Julian stared at a final notice from the bank. The weight of his impending ruin pressed heavily on his broad shoulders. His phone buzzed with an unexpected summons. The architect of ICE wanted to see him in her penthouse office. He stepped off the private elevator, his dusty work boots leaving faint marks on the pristine floors of the executive suite. Victoria sat behind her desk, immaculate once again in a sharp navy dress, holding all the leverage in the room. Without a word of gratitude, she slid a binding contract and a staggering bank statement across the polished glass. The number on the bank statement was staggering. $5 million, enough to erase his debt and secure his daughter's entire future. Victoria explained the terms with clinical precision. She required a partner on paper for 18 months to stabilize her corporate empire. Julian stared at her in quiet disgust. He refused to be treated like an asset purchased off a shelf. Victoria remained entirely unfazed. She coldly reminded him that he could keep his pride, or he could keep his family home. The muscles in Julian's jaw feathered. The undeniable truth of his desperation twisted like a knife. He thought of his little girl, of the home they were about to lose. The heavy burden of fatherhood outweighed his anger. When he looked back at the billionaire, his green eyes were devoid of warmth. He accepted the financial arrangement. But he laid down an absolute condition. His daughter had to meet the buyer, and if the child felt uncomfortable, the deal was dead. Victoria offered a razor-sharp, confident smile. She had conquered hostile boardrooms, she feared no child. She effortlessly agreed to host them for dinner, entirely unaware of the profound judgment awaiting her. Friday evening descended on the city. High above the glittering grid of Chicago, Victoria's $25 million penthouse awaited its guests. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, vast expanses of glass and stark white marble. Beautiful, yet utterly sterile. Victoria treated the dinner like a high-stakes corporate acquisition. She had deployed her wealth as a tactical weapon. A calculated mountain of limited-edition toys and expensive gadgets sat in the corner, a desperate attempt to purchase a child's approval. At exactly 7 o'clock, the private elevator chimed, breaking the oppressive silence of the luxury suite. Julian stepped out. He wore a simple charcoal shirt, his broad frame looking deeply out of place in the pristine environment. Holding tightly to his hand was his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. She held a small, hand-carved wooden sparrow close to her chest. Victoria approached them with a bright, heavily practiced smile, crouching down so her expensive perfume washed over the child. She proudly gestured toward the mountain of extravagant toys, announcing that she had bought every single one just for her. Chloe stared at the lavish pile. Any normal child would have bolted toward them screaming with joy, but she simply stood in quiet observation. The dinner began in agonizing silence. The massive dining table felt more like a cold corporate boardroom than a place for a shared meal. Victoria attempted conversation, but her questions sounded like sterile interview prompts meant to extract data rather than build connection. Julian barely touched his expensive food, his protective green eyes darting between his highly observant daughter and the billionaire. Sensing the lack of emotional progress, Victoria shifted tactics. She reached under the table, retrieving the sleek leather folder. She placed it next to Julian's plate with a definitive thud, accompanied by a small velvet box containing the platinum band. She shifted fully into her boardroom persona, coldly reminding him that the $5 million were ready for immediate transfer. Seeking to close the deal permanently, Victoria turned her intense attention to the child, speaking in a measured, transactional tone. She explained to Chloe that her father was entering a strategic partnership, and in return, they would receive a perfect, flawless life. Julian's stomach twisted. He opened his mouth to stop the uncomfortable charade, ready to abandon the money and leave. But before he could speak, Chloe gently put down her silver fork and looked directly into Victoria's confident blue eyes. "You want to buy my dad?" Chloe asked. Her voice carried no anger, only a profound, heartbreaking pity. Victoria was caught entirely off guard. She quickly tried to correct the child, insisting it was a strategic partnership. Chloe simply pointed a small finger toward the massive pile of expensive boxes in the corner of the room. She explained that Victoria bought those toys because she didn't want to play with them, she simply wanted to own them. Victoria froze. The blood drained from her flawless face as her impenetrable corporate armor began to crack. The 7-year-old girl turned her gaze to the expensive platinum ring sitting inside the velvet box. She spoke of her mother's simple silver band, remembering how her father's eyes always looked warm when he saw it. "When he looks at you," Chloe stated with devastating clarity, "he looks like he is carrying heavy wood." The word struck Victoria with physical force. The brilliant, intimidating CEO was left absolutely speechless. Chloe tilted her head, delivering the final, quiet judgment. Are you rich enough to buy out a ghost? Absolute silence filled the $25 million penthouse. The invincible CEO had been entirely dismantled by a 7-year-old child. A heavy crystal glass slipped from Victoria's trembling hand, spilling cold water across the polished marble table. She stared at the $5 million contract. It no longer looked like a shrewd maneuver, it looked like a desperate attempt to purchase human connection. Julian slowly stood up, breaking the heavy tension. The anger was gone from his rugged face, replaced by a quiet dignity. He reached down and gently lifted his daughter, settling her securely against his broad shoulder. He looked at Victoria one last time, quietly instructing her to keep her money, because some things were simply not for sale. Turning his back on the broken billionaire, he began the long walk across the white marble toward the private elevator. Victoria watched them walk away. The terrifying, undeniable realization of her complete isolation crashed down upon her. A single, ragged word tore out of her throat. Wait. It was not a corporate command, it was a desperate plea. Julian stopped in his tracks. His calloused hand hovered over the elevator button, the heavy silence returning to the room. Julian turned around slowly, his green eyes heavily guarded. He fully expected another manipulation, another calculated negotiation. Victoria stood up from the massive table. She looked uncharacteristically unsteady, the invincible billionaire suddenly appearing fragile. She walked over to the heavy leather portfolio that held their binding agreement. With trembling hands, Victoria tore the thick document entirely in half, the sharp sound echoing through the room. She let the ruined pieces of the $5 million contract fall discarded into a wastebasket. Retrieving her phone, she typed a rapid, final command before looking back at the rugged carpenter. Her voice was stripped of all authority as she announced that the contract was gone, but the funds had been transferred anyway. She offered the fortune as an unconditional apology, a compensation for the danger he had faced in her lobby. Julian froze in deep confusion. He searched her tear-stained face for a hidden trap or corporate leverage. But he found nothing of the sort. He saw only a woman who had finally realized she was standing in a fortress entirely alone. Victoria turned away, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. She quietly told him to go home, to save his family and keep his ghost alive. The private elevator doors chimed open behind Julian. A warm breeze from the shaft offered a clean escape from this chaotic world. He looked down at Chloe. The young girl met his gaze and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. Julian let the heavy metal doors slide shut. He turned around and walked slowly back across the room toward the ruined CEO. He stated firmly that he did not accept charity, and his pride would never allow him to keep $5 million for doing absolutely nothing. Victoria looked up, her expression a mixture of profound confusion and lingering despair. She opened her mouth to plead with him. But Julian interrupted, his voice steady. He explained that his integrity would not let him walk away when someone did something genuinely selfless. He reached out to the marble table and picked up the small velvet box. He did not put the ring on, he simply slipped it into his pocket. He promised to put on a suit and stand beside her at the corporate gala the following night. Not as an employee, but as a favor. When Victoria softly asked why, Julian replied with quiet authority that nobody should have to face the collapse of their world alone. The following evening, the grand ballroom of the city's most historic hotel was a sea of diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and generational wealth. It was the premier corporate event of the season. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and predatory gossip. Suddenly, the heavy gilded double doors swung open, and the sprawling room went entirely quiet. Victoria VanCleef stepped inside. She had shed her usual intimidating corporate armor for a simple, stunningly elegant emerald gown. But what truly stopped the room was the man holding her arm. Julian Hayes commanded the space without trying. He wore a classic black tuxedo that fit his broad, muscular frame perfectly, moving with absolute confidence. Yet, he did not look like he belonged to the 1%. The faint scars on his hands and his vigilant gaze marked him as an outsider. He walked with the heavy, grounded stride of a man who built things with his hands, not a man who bought them.
I have never seen him here before.
Whispers immediately broke out across the ballroom as the elite scrambled to identify the mysterious man taming the architect of ice. Victoria tightened her grip on his arm, warning him that the conservative patriarch was waiting to dissect them. Julian simply told him to try. Arthur Whitmore, a towering patriarch with flint-like eyes, sat at the head table, flanked by his executives. He watched Victoria and Julian approach, his calculating gaze evaluating the mysterious outsider in a fraction of a second. Arthur stood to greet them, his smile polite but his tone laced with thinly veiled condescension.
It was uneventful.
He immediately zeroed in on Julian, remarking that the elusive fiancé did not look like a Wall Street man. Julian met the billionaire's gaze without a flinch, extending a firm, unapologetic hand. He calmly introduced himself, stating clearly that he was not in finance, but owned an architectural carpentry firm. A quiet murmur rippled through the surrounding executives. The elite circle was taken aback by the presence of a laborer. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. He mockingly asked how a man who works with his hands captured the most ruthless CEO in the city. Victoria tensed, her mind racing to deploy the carefully fabricated public relations story they had rehearsed. But Julian stepped forward, silencing the table by stating he did not meet a CEO, he met a woman standing under a falling chandelier. Julian continued his explanation, describing the heavy steel cable that snapped on his active work site, sending a 1-ton chandelier plummeting toward her. He vividly detailed how he tackled her out of the drop zone, and how they spent their first moments screaming at each other on shattered marble. Arthur stared at him in absolute disbelief, pointing out that no one in the financial world ever dared to scream at the architect of ice. Julian calmly replied that he did, and she accepted it. He looked down at Victoria, his green eyes filled with genuine, profound respect. He addressed the table, stating that everyone in the room was terrified of her armor, but he saw the reality underneath the surface. He described a woman carrying the crushing weight of an entire corporate empire on her shoulders, exhausted to the point of missing obvious warning signs. Julian asserted that Victoria did not need a strategic partner to merge portfolios with, she needed someone to remind her to look up. The opulent table fell into an absolute, deafening silence. No one had ever spoken about Victoria VanCleef with such raw, unfiltered humanity. Arthur Whitmore stared piercingly at the carpenter. He searched the younger man's face for corporate spin, manipulation, or a rehearsed lie. He found absolutely nothing. Slowly, a genuine, warm smile cracked the stern, deeply lined face of the conservative European patriarch. Arthur spoke, his deep voice carrying a newfound, warm respect. He admitted he had nearly cancelled the merger, believing her company lacked a soul. He slowly raised his crystal champagne glass, bypassing the executives to toast the rugged carpenter standing firmly before him. Arthur declared the multi-billion-dollar acquisition safe. A leader capable of recognizing such profound integrity was a partner he could finally trust. An immense, physical wave of relief washed over Victoria. The hostile threat to her empire had been completely neutralized. Yet, as the gala continued and the elites celebrated, a quiet, terrifying realization began to settle in her chest. Seeking quiet, they stepped out onto the grand stone balcony. The cold night wind whipped around them as the city lights stretched endlessly below. Victoria turned to Julian, her voice soft against the wind, confirming that the $5 million would be fully cleared by morning. She insisted he take the fortune, not as charity, but as rightful compensation for saving her entire corporate existence. Julian simply looked out at the glowing skyline, his broad shoulders relaxed. He firmly reminded her that it was merely a favor. Victoria looked up at the rugged man. In that quiet moment, she realized she no longer cared about the historic merger, she only cared about the profound emptiness she would face without him. The cold wind continued to howl. Victoria stood frozen on the balcony, absorbing the heavy weight of Julian's absolute refusal. He turned his back on the glittering skyline and walked slowly back into the warmth of the grand ballroom. He did not look back. He was a man who kept his word, ready to leave the toxic world of limitless wealth behind. By midnight, the gala concluded. Arthur Whitmore shook Victoria's hand, cementing the multi-billion-dollar empire permanently. But as the cameras flashed, Victoria's eyes were utterly hollow. The ultimate corporate victory tasted like ashes. Hours later, she returned to her $25 million penthouse. The massive space was shrouded in suffocating darkness. She dropped her expensive clutch onto the marble floor. The echoing silence of the luxurious tomb was deafening. Her gaze drifted to the metallic wastebasket, where the torn pieces of her final manipulative contract still lay. Miles away, across the sleeping city, Julian gently tucked his daughter into a small, modest bed. The young girl asked softly about the wealthy woman. Julian quietly replied that even the thickest ice eventually cracks. The following morning, Julian was abruptly awakened by an urgent call from his financial institution. The imminent seizure of his home had been immediately halted. A massive, untraceable transfer had completely erased his debt. He stared at the screen in disbelief. Victoria had secured his family's future in absolute secrecy, expecting nothing in return. Simultaneously, a massive shockwave struck the global financial markets. Digital screens across the city flashed breaking news. Victoria VanCleef was officially stepping down as the head of her empire. Panicked executives scrambled in boardrooms, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden resignation of the invincible leader. High above the chaos, Victoria stood in her expansive office for the final time, dressed not in silk, but in simple denim and a plain sweater. She looked at her reflection in the towering glass, finally seeing a living, breathing woman instead of a flawless corporate machine. Without a backward glance, she walked out of the executive suite, leaving the heavy burden of the billionaire lifestyle behind. Stepping out onto the bustling streets, she took a deep breath of raw city air, completely free for the first time in a decade. The news of Victoria's resignation reached across the Atlantic. Arthur Whitmore sat in his expansive study, reading the financial headlines. The conservative patriarch did not react with anger. Instead, a deep, respectful smile formed as he realized she had finally chosen a life over an empire. Without hesitation, Arthur signed the final documents, securing the merger and preserving the legacy she had sacrificed everything to build. Miles away from the corporate chaos, Victoria sat in the back of a standard city cab. There were no bodyguards, no tinted limousines. The towering glass skyscrapers gradually faded, replaced by the quiet, tree-lined streets of a modest suburban neighborhood. She stepped out onto the pavement, holding a small slip of paper. It was the address of the botanical architecture firm. Behind a low wooden fence, Julian knelt in the dark soil. He was carefully tending to a vibrant patch of yellow roses. On the wooden porch steps nearby, Chloe sat quietly in the afternoon sun, gently tracing the wings of her wooden sparrow. Victoria approached the boundary of their quiet world. She rested her hands on the weathered wooden gate, hesitant to break their peace. The rustle of the autumn leaves caused Julian to pause. He looked up from the soil, his green eyes locking onto the woman at the gate. Julian wiped the dark soil from his calloused hands, standing up slowly as he faced the unexpected arrival at his garden gate. Victoria pushed open the weathered wood, stepping across the threshold. She was leaving her towering glass empire entirely behind her. From the wooden porch, Chloe watched closely. The young girl observed the former billionaire with a quiet, new sense of approval. Victoria admitted she had walked away from the multi-billion-dollar merger. She realized that building a life was infinitely more valuable than acquiring assets. Julian listened in silence. He studied her face, finding no corporate mask, only the genuine vulnerability of a woman starting over. He did not offer a contractual agreement. Instead, he extended his rough, scarred hand in a silent, genuine invitation to stay. Victoria reached out, her pale fingers gripping his calloused hand. The warmth and strength anchored her to a reality she had never known. Chloe stepped down from the porch, holding out her wooden sparrow. It was a simple, silent acceptance from the ultimate judge. The autumn sun bathed the modest garden in a rich, golden hue, entirely replacing the cold, sterile light of the penthouse. For the first time in a decade, Victoria smiled. It was not a calculated maneuver, but the pure relief of finally finding a home. The peaceful days that followed were a profound departure from Victoria's previous existence. She learned to find value in the quiet moments, trading boardroom strategies for the simple rhythm of a modest life. Julian observed her transformation closely. His initial respect slowly deepened into a quiet, unshakable devotion. However, the relentless machine of the corporate media was not willing to let the architect of ICE vanish peacefully. A highly ambitious investigative journalist managed to trace the massive, anonymous financial transfer. The digital footprint led the media directly to the quiet, tree-lined streets of the suburban haven. One crisp morning, the tranquility of the garden was violently shattered by a barrage of camera flashes. A swarm of aggressive photographers descended upon the low wooden fence, shouting intrusive demands for the truth. Chloe shrank back against the porch railing, terrified by the sudden, overwhelming chaos disrupting her home. Julian did not hesitate. He stepped forward instantly, his broad frame forming an impenetrable shield between the blinding lights and his family. The blinding camera flashes continued to assault the peaceful property. Julian stood like an immovable fortress, absorbing the invasive glare. He pointed a stern, calloused finger at the lead photographer, his deep voice carrying a final, absolute warning regarding trespassing. The aggressive mob ignored the warning, pushing harder against the wooden fence, demanding statements about the multi-million-dollar transfer. Victoria watched Julian's broad back. For the first time in her entirely isolated life, she was being fiercely protected. She glanced at Chloe, who was still trembling on the porch. Victoria realized she had to kill the ghost of her corporate past completely. Stepping out from behind Julian's protective shadow, she did not hide. She faced the flashing cameras with profound calm. She delivered a short, decisive statement, declaring her corporate life dead and her private life permanently closed to the public. To ensure the message was received, Julian calmly retrieved the heavy garden hose, aiming the brass nozzle directly at the fence. Without hesitation, he unleashed a powerful blast of cold water. The reporters scattered instantly, shielding their expensive lenses in utter panic. As the chaotic mob retreated to their vans, silence returned. Victoria placed a grateful hand on Julian's wet shoulder, entirely safe. The aggressive paparazzi incident became the final footnote in Victoria's public life. The media quickly lost interest in a woman planting flowers. The suburban haven returned to its peaceful rhythm. The defensive walls they had built against the outside world were no longer needed. Victoria did not let her brilliant, analytical mind go to waste. She simply redirected her formidable energy toward a new purpose. Sitting at a modest wooden kitchen table, she began reviewing the financial structure of Julian's struggling botanical firm. Julian watched in awe as the former CEO restructured his chaotic ledgers with ruthless, breathtaking efficiency. Within weeks, the small carpentry and landscaping business was operating with the precision of a multinational conglomerate. Victoria found profound satisfaction in building something tangible, something that created life instead of simply consuming assets. Julian's respect for her grew exponentially. They were no longer two desperate people brought together by a disastrous accident. They were equal partners, balancing each other perfectly, one building the physical structures, the other fortifying the unseen foundation. One quiet evening, as they reviewed blueprints under a warm desk lamp, Julian reached across the table, his calloused hand finding hers. The gentle touch bridged the final gap between their two worlds. It was not a signed contract, but a genuine, unbreakable commitment. As winter melted into spring, their partnership flourished. The frozen isolation of the past was entirely replaced by the warmth of shared purpose. The botanical architecture firm prospered. Julian's masterful designs, supported by Victoria's strategic brilliance, began winning massive city contracts. Walking through a newly constructed community greenhouse, Victoria marveled at the vibrant life they had cultivated together from the dirt up. Chloe was no longer the quiet, wary child holding on to the past. She ran freely through the sunlit gardens, her laughter echoing brightly. Together, Victoria and the young girl planted a new oak sapling in the front yard, laying down deep roots for a shared future. Julian watched them from the wooden porch. The heavy burden he had carried for years was gone, replaced by a profound, healing peace. The outside world made one final attempt to intrude. A lucrative corporate offer arrived, promising millions for a return to the financial empire. Victoria retrieved the thick, gold-embossed envelope from the mailbox. She read the staggering numbers with complete, unshakable indifference. Without a second thought, she dropped the offer into the recycling bin, turning her back on the hollow wealth of her former life forever. Walking back to the house, Victoria felt a profound sense of liberation. The ghosts of her corporate empire were finally laid to rest. Julian was waiting at the kitchen table, quietly sketching the blueprints for their next community garden project. She sat beside him, resting her head on his broad shoulder. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with deep contentment. As the years passed, their humble botanical firm grew into a thriving enterprise, rooted entirely in creation rather than destruction. Chloe flourished alongside the gardens. The young girl who once observed the world with wary eyes now lived with vibrant, unshakable joy. Victoria looked down at her own hands. They were no longer pristine, but slightly calloused, bearing a simple, elegant silver wedding band. She had learned the profound truth that Chloe had spoken on that fateful dinner night years ago. Julian approached, his green eyes warm and completely unguarded. He loved her freely, without contracts, without conditions. Standing together amidst a sea of blooming yellow roses, they watched the golden sun dip below the suburban horizon. In the end, the woman who thought she could buy the world discovered that the most priceless connection was the one that could never be bought.